Hi, welcome to Lessons in Humanities. The topic of today's lesson is the American Revolution. Today I'm going to discuss some of the long-term origins and the short-term causes of the American Revolution. And of course, I'm going to talk about the American Revolution and the consequences. If you are interested in this PowerPoint presentation or other lessons that can help you teach American history or other lessons in humanities, please visit my store. The information is in the link below. And of course, if you enjoy this lesson, please give me a like and subscribe to my channel. I'm going to go through all of American history from the Native Americans to the Spanish, all the way up into 2020 and beyond. So let's begin. Okay, so like I said, today's discussion is about the American Revolution, but I'd like to review a little bit. If you'd like to see some of my older videos, please check out my channel. I have some videos from colonial America and Spanish America. But the American Revolution, there was, it was happened in 1775, right? And it's going to be hundreds of years before that the Europeans even came to the New World. So for thousands of years, there were the Native Americans, and then there were the Spanish who came in 1492 and dominated the continent for 100 years. It wasn't until 1607 that the English came. And for about 150, a little more than 150 years, the English and then the British would develop and become more prominent and more developed. They want to move westward. And then eventually there would be some disputes between the colonists in British America and the motherland, Britain. And that's going to lead to the American Revolution, which of course leads to a new country, which is the United States of America. So if we look at this timeline, it's always easier to put history into chunks instead of trying to remember every single little date, which is really impossible. You can remember some of the more important dates: 1492, 1776, 1865. But it's hard to remember all these little dates. But if you can put it into certain chunks, it might be easier for you to remember history and identify what place does each event take place in. So this follows the AP US history timelines. So this is the third time period in the AP US history timeline. And it starts with 1754 and ends in 1800. So the beginning of this is the 7 Years' War. And the 7 Years' War is important because the British Empire will expand, become unmanageable, right? And it would also force the British to tax the colonists to pay for the war debt. And this is going to lead to the revolution. So this is a very important point. It's a turning point, right? It's going to lead to the American Revolution, which is going to create a new country. And the end of this timeline is 1800. So this is when there's a peaceful transfer from the Federalist Party to Democratic Republican Party, John Adams to Thomas Jefferson. So it showed that the new government could actually work. But here's a timeline. Please pause and look at it if you like. But what you can see here is in 1754 to 63 is the French and Indian War. And then after that is the Pontiac's Rebellion. And the Pontiac's Rebellion is a fight of a united tribes of Native Americans who are going to fight against the British and the British colonists who were trying to move westward after the 7 Years' War. Because after the 7 Years' War, British America became very, very big. It took all the land from the French all the way to the Mississippi and up in Canada. And of course, the people who fought in that war, the colonists, they wanted to move west. They wanted to take more land. They fought for it. They died for it. And of course, the Native Americans, they didn't want people to take their land. They've been there for thousands of years. But the important point here is Pontiac's Rebellion convinced King George III and Britain, the British government, to pass a law called the Proclamation of 1763, which would stop colonists from moving west, and that would infuriate them. Why should I fight or die for a war and I can't move west? That's why I fought the war. And then there's going to be taxes to pay for the debt, and you can see them here: the Sugar Act and Currency Act, Stamp Act, Townshend Act. We're going to talk about it today. It's all going to lead to the American Revolution. Now, as I mentioned, this picture is of the 7 Years' War. British America had become quite developed, and the British early on, in the 1600s, they were letting the colonists develop as they preferred, right? They developed their own governments, their own culture. Of course, very influenced by the British, the forms of governments within the 13 colonies, but they grow a little bit separate, right? And when the war came, the 7 Years' War, after this war, the British Americans, they were very happy to be British, right? They're very proud to be British. But that wouldn't last long, right? The British are going to exert more control, right? It had become a mercantilist society. And that means that the colonies, their sole purpose was to provide sources and to support the motherland, Britain. So it went from little control to great control. And after the 7 Years' War, it's going to be way too much control. And that's what's going to lead to the American Revolution. So what are the origins of the American Revolution? Well, as I mentioned before, the colonists were accustomed to kind of being left alone for many years, actually many decades. And there wasn't a clear definition of what their relationship was, or how they fit into the British Empire. Though they pledged allegiance to the king, they were proud to be British, they didn't really know where they were within the empire. And there's different reasons for that. One reason for that is that the British never defined it. They didn't make it very clear where they were, and they wanted to, right? There was two parties, or two kind of factions within the British government that wanted to decide where the British Empire, where the British America fit. And one was more authoritarian, where they wanted to tax them and they wanted to give them less money and really wanted to control them, right, as part of the empire. And another faction didn't want to do that much. They wanted to let them kind of be and grow economically free. They thought that would be better for British America and for the British Empire. But the important point here is neither one was able to formulate or to agree as to what type of relationship with the British Americans they would have. And there's reasons for that. I mean, they were at war. They were at war for more than, from 1688 to this, the mid 1700s to about 1763. They were constantly at war in Europe and also in the Americas, the last being the 7 Years' War. And wars take time, they take money, and they were unable to set the time to agree as to the place the British Americans had in the British Empire. And the colonists, they developed their own understanding, their own agreement, what they felt they were, because they had kind of grown independently already, right? They formed their own local governments, and the government, it depended on what colony, but some of the governors were chosen by the king or by the crown. But they did develop their own little systems within each of the colonies, and they taxed themselves, right? They had like a local assembly, which is like a congress or a parliament, which would tax the local citizens, but they were representative, so they accepted those taxes. But the understanding the colonists had of their place in the British Empire, though it wasn't stated, was different than what the British thought, especially King George III, who was going to be a very authoritarian king. They separated separately, or they developed separately, like I said, politically and culturally. So it's across the ocean. It takes a long time to go across the ocean. So over decades or a century, obviously they're going to grow separate from Britain. There's also the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment were these ideas that took place in the late 1600s and in the 1700s, and that there was lots of thinkers or philosophers who were challenging old ideas on government and religion and people's place within society. And some of these new ideas included, for example, natural rights or individual rights that everybody should have and that the government should protect. This is John Locke. He talked about the government protecting people's life, liberty, and property. And you will see lots of this language used in the founding documents when America becomes a country. But the Enlightenment is just a movement that happened all throughout Europe, and it changed Europe, but it's also going to change British America and then the United States of America when it becomes a country. There's also the Great Awakening. And the Great Awakening, this is kind of like a counter movement to the Enlightenment, happened in the 1730s and 1740s. This was a revival of religion, right? So early on in British America, it was very religious, especially like the Puritan New England area with Massachusetts. And some of the early settlers, they couldn't even celebrate Christmas. They couldn't even dance, or, if you didn't follow the Calvinist beliefs, which was the Protestant religion of the Puritans, you could be punished or banished from that area. And then some people moved and started their own colonies to get away from such a strict religious society. But nonetheless, it was strict throughout. It was religious throughout the colonies, a Protestant religion, right? It could be the Calvinists in the north, and it could be the Anglicans in the middle or the south. There was some Catholicism, some Catholics, but not many, right? It was mostly the French and the Spanish in the New World that were Catholics. But there was some Catholics and some Jews, but mostly a Protestant, very strict religious British America. Well, the Great Awakening, people started getting away from that, right? The North became a little bit less strict, and you could celebrate Christmas, and people started going to church less. And Enlightenment ideas, right? People question, is there really a God, or should religion be involved with government? Some of these ideas were coming to fruition with the Enlightenment in the times in the 1700s. So the Great Awakening was just this counter movement where they had people like Jonathan Edwards, who was a strict Calvinist, preaching about the necessity of coming back to God and being forgiven for your sins. George Whitefield, another preacher who would go from the north to the south, giving hundreds of speeches to huge crowds of people in spasms and getting excited. He was a very good speaker. But the important point here is though this was a counter to the Enlightenment in a way, it was challenging old ideas, right? It was challenging religion. It was challenging authority, right? What people used to say, the Puritan, Calvinist, strict ideals, it's challenging some of those ideals. And so did the Enlightenment in a different way. But this is kind of the big picture. We have this undefined relationship between the British America and the colonies, British America and the British Empire. This misunderstanding of what that relationship is, right? And then also these movements that are challenging old ideas. And one of those ideas that might be challenged are some of the ideas that are coming from Britain, right? And their authoritarian government that's going to be formed under George III. And there's George III right there. But the short-term causes, and I listed them here, but I'm going to go over them individually in the following slides. These are some of the major short-term causes that are going to immediately lead to shots being fired, right? First of all, it's the authoritarian King George III. Like I said earlier, there was two camps in Britain. Should we really control them and tax them and not give them much money and use them, exploit them? Or should we let them be free and grow economically free, and it'll benefit both countries, British America and British Empire, which is really one country. But in authoritarian, King George III chose the first. With his supporters, they were going to exert more control, right? Now just remember, the war is over. The 7 Years' War is over, and the territory in the Americas, in British America, had just expanded greatly up to Canada and Quebec, all the way to the Mississippi River. So they have all this land, and they also got land in India. So the British Empire was too big; they couldn't manage it, right? But nonetheless, King George III wants to exert more control over the colonists. They had it too easy for too long, I guess you could say. But the first event after the 7 Years' War that's going to really anger the colonists in British America is the Proclamation of 1763, and that's what I mentioned before, where they told the British Americans that they couldn't go past this line, which was drawn in the Appalachian Mountains. They couldn't go west of that, and there was all this land all the way to the Mississippi, but they were not allowed to go there for the simple reason that the British did not want to fight Pontiac and his united group of tribes that were attacking the British Americans. He couldn't afford it, and he didn't want to fight it. They were fighting, like I said, for almost 100 years. So he didn't want to fight it, so he told the British Americans, you can't go there. And the British Americans said, well, I just fought a war for that land, and now you say I can't go there? So this is the first step, right? And like I said, wars are expensive. And the British thought, well, we sent all these troops to British America to fight the French, to help them, to fight the Native Americans in the 7 Years' War. And we have so much debt, right? And a lot of that debt is from the wars in Europe and India during the 7 Years' War. It was really a world war. Well, they need money. How are they going to get the money? Well, let's get money from the colonists, the British America. We help them. They should pay some of this as well, right? Well, that's going to lead to Sugar Act, Currency Act, Stamp Act, Townshend Act, Tea Act, all these different acts that you see here is to get money, right? And some of these were not just for money, it was for different reasons. And I'll explain that in the following slides. But that's going to lead to the American Revolution. So that's a very short term. I mean, after the 7 Years' War, the British Americans were very proud to be British. They're very proud to defeat the French. They didn't want to be separate, right? But that's not going to last very long. It's only going to be 12 years after the 7 Years' War that the American Revolution is going to begin. So you can really see how it is a turning point, how it really did cause the American Revolution. So let's start looking at some of these. Sugar Act and the Currency Act. Now, the Sugar Act was a tax on sugar. Now, this was to raise more money to pay the war debt. But there was already a Sugar Act in British America. The problem was that many people didn't pay it. They ignored it or they smuggled sugar. And so they were, the British Empire the British government wasn't able to collect the money from the Sugar Act. So this Sugar Act actually made the tax cheaper, which is strange. Why would the colonists be angry? Because now it's cheaper. Well, see, that's the thing is before they just ignored it or they smuggled or they got around it. It was pretty easy. But now the British government is going to exert more control. They're going to make sure you pay for it. It's half, but you got to pay for it. And if you don't pay for it, well, you're going to be tried. You're going to be going to court. And they didn't give them a trial by jury, which was the tradition in British America and in many of the colonies and what was expected, because this is a problem. When a government doesn't have trial by jury, then the government decides if somebody is guilty or not. So if you are, for example, an enemy of the governor or a local official and you're accused of smuggling, if you defend yourself, well, maybe you're innocent and you become a political prisoner. So let's say I'm smuggling some sugar, or maybe I'm not, and I'm accused of it, but I've been very critical of the local governor. Well, maybe I would go to jail for smuggling for something I didn't do, right? So this is why trial by jury is very important back then and today, right? It's going to come in the United States when they have the Bill of Rights. But that was the problem. It was that control. It was that enforcement that made the colonists angry, and now they have to pay the sugar tax. Before they didn't have to. They could get around it. Now they got to pay it or they get into some trouble. So this is going to make them angry. They're already angry because they can't go west. Now they're angry because of this, right? Now this doesn't affect everybody, but it's going to start to have that ripple effect, start to affect more and more, and more discontent is going to rise in the colonies. You also have the Currency Act. So during, before this 70, or in British America, there was some currencies made in some of the colonies, but there were problems, right? So there was counterfeit that was rampant. It was very easy to counterfeit the money. Printed too much, just like today, print too much and the value would go down. But also, if I have money from Pennsylvania and I go to New York, I can't spend it. I can only spend Pennsylvania money in Pennsylvania, New York money in New York. So there was some problem with the currency. But you need a currency to run an economy. So they made it illegal to print money in British America, which is for the reasons I just mentioned. But this is going to hurt the economy. And the economy was just starting to repair itself after the 7 Years' War. This is going to make the colonists angry. This is going to make the British Americans angry. So what we got here is we have increased taxes and restricted liberties. And this is, and we're going to see this snowball effect where the colonists and British Americans are going to get angrier and angrier and angrier until shots are fired. But the big act is the Stamp Act. Now, the Stamp Act, this taxed newspapers, pamphlets, documents, legal documents, playing cards, and many, many paper things, right? But the important thing here is this was an eternal tax, right? So before, an eternal tax would only be by the local assemblies in the colonies, the local governments, the local congresses, if you will. And people accepted that because they had, at least the landowning wealthy, had representation within those local governments. So they could accept that, right? And before, when the British taxed, it was all an external. They were all external taxes, like imports and exports, like sugar, right? But now they do the first internal. And this is when people start saying, wait, what's this? No taxation without representation. You know, we have no representation in Parliament, in the British government, but you're taxing us these internal taxes. So this is going to be a problem. And the Stamp Act is also important because it's going to affect a lot more people. Some of the other taxes only affected a small amount of people, but here you have printers and lawyers and students and common people who like to play cards. Anybody who used paper was being taxed. So this really accelerated the anger that was happening in the colonies. And this is only 10 years before the American Revolution. So they're going to have to resist, right? So there's going to be some resistance to the Stamp Act. And there's different ways to resist back then and today. But here are some three general categories of the resistance after the Stamp Act. And it's going to continue a little bit later as well. So we have the legislative. So that's like resolutions passed by the local governments. And they're going to pass some resolutions, like in Virginia, called the Virginia Resolves, and that's going to influence other colonies. And it's going to call on the king to stop these taxes and this control, right? More specifically, the Stamp Act. But these different resolves, these different legislative procedures throughout the colonies is going to lead to what is called the Stamp Act Congress. And that's just a delegation of members from different colonies meeting to decide how they're going to respond to the Stamp Act. And in it, they did pledge allegiance to the king, right? They didn't want to be, they're still proud to be British, right? But they wanted to be just like the British, just like the people in Britain, right? They wanted to have a trial by jury. None of this trial by the government. If I try to smuggle some sugar, I want to have a jury so I can defend myself. And also taxed by elected officials. So we already had our assemblies taxing us. That's fine. We have representation there. Give us representation in the Parliament and in Britain, or stop taxing us in this way. The second way is economic. So economic is, and this works brilliantly throughout history, is to get them where it hurts, in the wallet, in the pocketbook. This was a non-importation agreement, and the colonists agreed to this. They actually signed pieces of paper where they agreed to not to buy or sell goods from Britain. Before this, owning British goods was a sign of status. It was like having a nice car today or a nice phone. This was a sign of being in the upper echelons of society, having something from Britain, a luxury good. Well, now they're telling people don't buy or sell anything. And this actually worked. In London, the merchants were hurt. And they talked to Parliament. They said, you got to stop the Stamp Act because we need to continue the trade. Our businesses are hurting. It actually worked. And we also have the protests and riots, which always work. Sons of Liberty was one of the groups. They were more radical and influential. And different Sons of Liberties, which, from Boston, all in different colonies too, they would grow as well, and they would rile up people. And some of these got pretty violent, right? So some attacked stamp distributors or other customs duty officers or different people in government, burned down their houses, or potentially tarred and feathered them. And that's what I have in this next picture here. If you see this is a picture of an official by the colonists being tarred and feathered. In the background, you see the Stamp Act upside down. You have a noose, like they're going to kill the guy. This picture right here was created from the British point of view. So you see these colonists really happy and just enjoying and just terrorizing this poor official, and you see them pouring tea into the sea behind that. Was it this bad? I mean, I think often in American history you see the patriots or the colonists who were fighting for their freedoms as these innocent people who were being treated poorly, but they could get pretty brutal, right, to get what they wanted done. And the protests and riots, well, they worked, along with the economic sanctions and the legislation, because the Stamp Act was repealed. So it worked, right? But King George III is authoritarian. He wants people to know who's in control, and this is not going to stop him, right? So even though this was repealed, and the people were happy, the British Americans were very happy. They were cheering. They were proud to be British again. There's going to be some time for peace. But at the very same time, which a lot of them didn't know because they were too busy celebrating, the British Empire passed what is called the Declaratory Acts. And this basically just said, okay, you know what? Stamp Act is repealed. You won, but we're the boss. We're the leaders. If we want to pass another internal tax or other act like this, we can. We have the right to do it. But this one's repealed. But nobody paid attention or even knew. Didn't hit the news, except for, I guess, the people in the know. This just kind of went by. Just went by peacefully, right? So there's some time for peace, though, right? They fought back, they resisted, and they won, the British America. But we got this authoritarian King George III that won't let them get away with too much. And they're going to pass another act. It's going to be called the Townshend Acts, getting closer and closer to the revolution. So there's peace, but Parliament passed the Townshend Acts. And this is when the British government would take more power from the local governments. They would tax lead and glass and paint and tea and other things. And just like the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act, they would enforce it more, right? And the offenders didn't get a trial by jury. And that's a big thing here. People could just be taken and put in the jail just because the governor didn't like you. So that was a big deal, and you got these taxes and it's being enforced. So this kind of independence that the colonists were kind of used to for many years, and their ancestors were used to, right? I mean, this is over decades, was being taken away from them slowly. And the discontent is spreading through the colonies. And they're going to have to resist some more, right? So there's going to be some more resistance. They're not going to just accept this from the British government. They want to be British. They don't want to be separate, but they're not going to accept this. They're going to continue the non-importation action, right? There's going to be something called the Daughters of Liberty, where they're going to make their own clothes, so you don't have to buy British clothes, right? They're going to form something called the Committee of Correspondence, and the Committee of Correspondence is where they're going to correspond between the colonies, like what's going on, what's happening in your colony, what's the tyrannical British doing now, and this communication is going to spread, and the resistance is going to spread, and discontent. And this is in 67. In 1768, well, the British, and again, they're going to continue their riots and their protesting. In 1768, the British are going to send more soldiers. They're going to bring a lot of soldiers to British America. One, to enforce these. So again, more control. Enforce these acts, like the Townshend Acts. But also, they're going to try to stop the protests and the rebellions. They want to stop it. They want to bring some type of peace, right? It's a more stable society. And then with these British troops there's going to be conflict. In 1770, there's more troops there, and some of them are near the Customs House on King Street in Boston. And a group of kind of rowdy people were there, and they started throwing snowballs. So many snowballs had ice in them, and rocks, and who knows what else at the British soldiers. And the British soldiers felt threatened. And a shot was fired, and of course more shots were fired, and 5 people died. It's not a lot. It's not a real massacre, right? But 5 people died at the hands of the British government, and at a time that is very tense, and where a lot of British Americans are already not happy about what's going on. But the important point here about the Boston Massacre is in this picture that you see right here. This is by Paul Revere and other ones. If you look at it, it looks like the British soldiers are just powerful and unforgiving and not caring, and almost enjoy shooting these innocent little colonists. But that's not what really happened. The colonists the soldiers later reported that they feared for their lives and that they were being attacked. And it's true that the colonists, they were being quite violent. But it didn't matter. You could have, this is virtually, propaganda. Something like this would spread throughout the colonies. And this is what people would read. And the British soldiers killed our people. And this would intensify the feelings and the desire to fight back, to resist the British control. So that's an important point here. Now, an interesting point about the British soldiers, they were defended by John Adams, who would become one of the more radical separatists, not until the war had started, but ones that wanted independence, a founding father. But John Adams, a lawyer, believes in people should be defended, and he defended them. And again, after this, the Townshend Acts are repealed, so the colonists win again. There's a couple years of peace and tranquility, and no new acts, right? You got the Stamp Act, it's gone. Townshend Acts, it's gone. But you got King George over there, King George III, who's not going to let those pesky colonists do whatever they want. You already have a lot of soldiers that had come over, right? And he still needed money, right? And there's this, there's the British East India Company, which sold tea. They had all this stock. They were going out of business. The government took over the company, actually. And what they decided to do was send the tea to America and sell it there for very cheap, right? And this is called the Tea Act. So yet another act, which means another thing to make the colonists angry. And this act, you had all this cheap tea to be sold in the colonies, and then the local colonists who were selling tea couldn't compete with them, right? They were forced to accept this tea, and they didn't like that, right? So what did the colonists do? The Sons of Liberty, some of them would wear Native American outfits like mohawks, attire, and then they would go onto these ships and they would spill all the tea into the Boston harbor. Other cities would soon follow, in Philadelphia and Charleston. This is called the Boston Tea Party. And if you look at the date, 1773, the war is almost there, right? It's almost time for war. Only 2 years before a war would begin. But the important part about this, about the Boston Tea Party, is the king is angry, right? The whole time he's so stubborn. He's not listening to the colonists. He's passing these new acts, even though they're rebelling, and they're resisting. But now he is angry because that's a lot of money, and that's just a complete disrespect to the crown. So the king is angry at the Boston Tea Party. So he is going to punish Boston, and that's going to lead to the war. He's going to pass another act, the Coercive Acts, 1774, 1 year before the war. Shots are going to be fired very soon. In the British America, they call these the Intolerable Acts because they were intolerable. But basically, Boston, it was put into like what you could call martial law. Boston port was shut down. It was blocked by the soldiers. They couldn't trade, right? The Massachusetts government, where Boston is, was completely under British control. No local government. They lost all their power. And no trials by jury. So if you were accused of stealing something or smuggling, you could just be tried whether you did it or not. And all the British soldiers that were coming to put out this rebellion, they were forced to stay in your house, right? You give them a bed and give them some food. You have no choice. And other things, like if you couldn't assemble, like if you're outside, if there's a group of 2 or 3 people, the soldiers would separate you, right? Maybe not that small, but like groups of people, they would be separated. So they really lost all their freedoms, and they were basically, they couldn't do anything in Boston. Now the other colonies, they're going to see this and they're going to say, what should we do? And it should be pointed out that in the colonies, in British America, they're the radical separatists, and then there's the moderates to the pacifists to the people that want to stay British, right? Often we call the patriots are the ones who wanted to fight the British. The loyalists wanted to support not fight them, but support the British, right? They're against the patriots. But this was kind of the last straw, and there had to be action taken against the Intolerable Acts, which was taken on Boston. And the other colonies had to decide, what are we going to do? Are we just going to let them go, fight them? We can't fight the British. That's ridiculous. We got to come up with some type of response. So at the same time, they meet for the first time, which is called the First Continental Congress, kind of like the Stamp Act Congress. Like, how should we respond to this mistreatment by the British Crown? So they wanted to coordinate a response, right? And within the delegation, there was different opinions on what should be done. Should you help Boston? Like, if you don't help Boston, they could be coming for Philadelphia. They could be coming for Charleston. You never know. And they also have they have a Continental Army, and they put George Washington, who was the hero from the 70 Years' War. It should be noted that some of the more moderate people in this delegation, they wrote something called the Olive Branch Petition, and they sent it to the king. And it basically said, let's compromise before there's real fighting, before the shots are fired. There was a few years back in Boston Massacre, but let's avoid a war. Let's kind of compromise, right? But King George III, he looked at it, no, he was angry about the Boston Tea Party. That was kind of the last straw for him. But anyways, why this is happening in Philadelphia, Boston is still under complete control, right, by the British. You can't even talk to other people on the streets because it's just completely being controlled. You know, they were rebellious, and now they're being completely controlled by the British. And you know, the British, they know about the Sons of Liberty, and supposedly in this little town called Lexington, not too far from there, you could walk there. That's what they did. They marched there, the British soldiers. But there was some arsenal, or where they had some ammunition for weapons, supposedly. Samuel Adams, right? One of the leaders of the Sons of Liberty, supposedly had a bunch of ammunition there. So the British soldiers, who are all controlling at this time, they march down the road all the way to Lexington. And along the way, you have the Paul Reveres and other people warning people that the British are coming. And you have local militias known as Minutemen who are ready to fight at any time. And when the soldiers come, shots are fired. right? So this is Lexington and Concord. The Minutemen, the militia, they're going to take some shots at the British soldiers. And the fighting is going to continue to the next town called Concord. So this is a small skirmish, but this is the first really battle of the American Revolution. Shots have been fired. At this point, they don't know it's going to turn into a full-out war, right? But it is. The British are actually going to go back to, after fighting at Lexington and Concord, they're going to hike back to Boston, where they have full control, and about 20,000 Minutemen or militia are going to follow them, attacking them along the way. So they really, the British Americans really showed a lot of passion, a lot of fighting power, because they weren't as organized or equipped like the British soldiers. They didn't even have uniforms like they did. But they followed them to Boston, and they went to Bunker Hill or Breed's Hill, which is right next to each other, and they kind of fortified there, and then the British would go there to fight them, and that would be the first major battle, called the Battle of Bunker Hill, which brings me to the next. Well, I'll talk about some of the battles here soon. But this is the beginning of the American Revolution. You can see this escalation of discontent. And looking back on history, you can always see King George was a little bit stubborn. He could have probably done things a little bit differently to avoid this, because a lot of Americans or British Americans wanted to be British. In fact, there still are a lot of loyalists that they probably don't want to fight, right? They want to risk their lives, but they also are proud to be British. But there's a growing camp of people that want to fight for their rights. And it should be noted at this point, 1775, this is not a war of independence. This is a war for more rights. It's to stop what's happening in Boston. It's for representation. This is not a war for independence. Surely there are some people who are thinking that, but not most people. And that brings us to American Revolution. Now, who's going to win this war? I mean, at 1775, clearly it's the British. They have help from the Hessians. Hessians are mercenary, and a mercenary means like a soldier who, it's his job, he gets paid for it. But they get help from the Hessians, and they're well equipped and financially better off than the British America. Stronger, more soldiers. They should win this war. Now, the British Americans, they shouldn't win this war. They're not well equipped. They didn't have the weapons or ammunition they needed. They did have great leadership in Washington and other generals. It turned out to be, at first, Washington didn't do good. They wanted to fire him, but it turned out for him to be an excellent leader. But the colonists, they also knew the geography better, so that was helpful, right? And they were going to lose some battles in the beginning, but very quickly, Washington and other generals are going to realize that they can't take a big battle head-to-head with the British. They just couldn't. So they were strategic. They would do like kind of guerrilla warfare or small attacks, right? They would avoid the big face-to-face attacks, which the British were so used to and trained from their wars fighting in Europe, right? Fighting the French or the different wars in Europe. In fact, some of the soldiers, the British soldiers, said this isn't a war like it is in back in Europe. It's a different type of war. But also, British America was going to do the long game, right? Wear them out. It take as long as it takes to tire them out and to win this war. But the war had started, right? And it started in Boston. We got the Lexington and Concord, small skirmish. Not long after, it's Bunker Hill. That's where the next battle is going to be. Now, here are the major points, right? The major battles. We could spend a year talking about the American Revolution, but Battle of Bunker Hill, I already talked about that, right? So Battle of Bunker Hill is in Boston. That's where all this started, with the Intolerable Acts. Well, the troops would be moved. The British troops would move to New York, another major city, and there would be the Battle of New York. And the Battle of New York, and Washington would actually be up there. Washington wasn't at Bunker Hill. He was in Philadelphia, being nominated by the Continental Congress at that time. But it would be a devastation for the British Americans. And the British Americans, like I said, they weren't organized. I mean, they had people wanting to fight, and they go fight, and they get scared, and they run away to home, right? And they didn't have uniforms, the equipment, mistakes by Washington. And in fact, the British had Washington and the Continental Army trapped in New York. But they didn't put them down. They could have stopped the war. They could have stopped the war easily, right, when they were on Long Island, right? But George Washington and the Continental Army snuck away, and they went to upstate New York and then down through Philadelphia, or not Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. But see, that's another problem with the British. They were too arrogant. There was this General Howe. He was sitting in Staten Island enjoying himself. He was going to see his mistress in Manhattan when he could have just stopped the Continental Army, let them sit there for a while, and then they snuck away. So lots of arrogance by the British. That's another reason that they lost. But nonetheless, at this point, Bunker Hill was a British victory, right? I mean, it was good for the colonists because they killed a lot of the soldiers, the British soldiers. It showed that they could fight, but they lost it. And New York was a disaster for Washington and the colonists. And the war didn't look like it was going good, and they needed some extra help, right? They needed help from France. That's what they wanted. Benjamin Franklin is in Paris at this time, enjoying himself, meeting people, going to parties, and meeting women and all this stuff, and trying to get the French to help. They said, well, we would love to help you. We hate the British, but it's a lost cause. You can't defeat them. There's no way. That was the idea with the French. So Benjamin Franklin would be there for a while. But nonetheless, after the disaster in New York, the Continental Army would escape, and they would go through Pennsylvania, and it became wintertime. And, during wintertime, just like a job or at school, you take a vacation. And when you take a vacation, you rest and relax and get your energy back, or train or do other things. And in 1776, on Christmas Day, Washington said, before we take our break, you know what? Let's go through let's cross the Delaware River, right? And on the other side in New Jersey, there's a bunch of Hessians who are all celebrating and who are all enjoying Christmas like anybody would, even during war, and surprise them. And surprise him he did. The Continental Army took very few casualties, and they inflicted lots of casualties on the Hessians who are fighting for the British. So this was a big victory for numerous reasons. It increased morale in the Continental Army. And it also showed George Washington was a good leader, because people were trying to take his job. People were trying to get him out of there, get him fired. But now he proved himself to be a good leader. And it's a victory, right? After some devastating losses in New York and Bunker Hill, it's a big victory. Now, the big victory, though, is going to come in Saratoga in upstate New York. So in Saratoga, in 1777, there was just another battle. It's going to be a major battle, but it's the first major battle or victory for the British Americans. The one after crossing the Delaware and Trenton was just a small one, but this is the first major one. And what happened? Basically, they won because, again, the British arrogance. That's another reason the British lost. General Howe, the same guy who was going to Manhattan to see his mistress when he could have finished the war, he was supposed to meet this guy named Burgoyne, who was coming from Canada, a British General Burgoyne. They were supposed to meet at Saratoga and surround the British American Continental Army. But he didn't do it, didn't communicate. He went to Philadelphia. He thought, well, let's conquer the big city, Philadelphia, which is obviously beneficial for the British, and that's what he did. But that left Burgoyne all by himself, who was all struggling from a long trek over the winter in the snow and losing men along the way. When he gets to Saratoga, the British colonists won this battle. The first major battle winning point in the American Revolution. It's a turning point. Why is it a turning point? One, it's the first major big battle. But number two, Benjamin Franklin's over there in France. He say, you come and help us. the French decided that they're going to help, right? The French are going to help with soldiers and supplies and money. And the war is going to change, right? Without the French, there would be no the United States of America. Now the French are going to help in Saratoga, right? And that same year, they're going to be in Valley Forge, 6-month period, another winter's break. Many soldiers are going to die from disease, but they're going to get some training, right? They're going to get some training from French soldiers, from this Prussian guy. His name is Van Steuben, Baron Van Steuben. They're going to get some uniforms. They're going to get some ammunition. They're going to get proper training. It's going to be a proper army. Before it wasn't. Now it is. And they just defeated the British in Saratoga, and they got the French on their side. So things are looking up for the British Americans. By this time, they're actually not British Americans; they're Americans. It's after the Declaration of Independence. But after Saratoga victory, and after getting ready with the training in the Valley of Fords, there's going to be some time for a break or a stalemate. Certainly there's some fighting, especially in the West and with Native Americans, right? These are only the most major battles. But there's going to be a stalemate for some time. But the British, they got Philadelphia, they got Boston, they got New York, and this is why haven't we won this war? If we were in Europe, the war would be over, but the war persists. So they decide, let's go to the South. Let's take the war to the South. Why go to the South? Well, there are more loyalists there. They can recruit loyalists, which they were not all that successful doing. But they can also, which they had already been doing, they could get African Americans and have them fight and say, okay, fight with us and you'll be free. And the idea was that they would win, they would be free in America, right, in British America. But they would get African Americans to help fight. And some African Americans helped the British Americans as well. But some battles in the South, it's going to end in Yorktown. So Yorktown, what happens in Yorktown? Well, you have General Cornwallis, one of the great leaders in the South. He goes up to Yorktown, which is right near Jamestown, where British America began, in Virginia, in the Chesapeake Bay. And right there, if you see the map, he goes there and he needs some more supplies and more troops and more people and more stuff, right? So he can fight the war in the South. And George Washington knows he's there. So George Washington and Marquis de Lafayette, for the French, they hiked their troops all the way down from New York to there, right? They're going to trap them. But all the while, Cornwallis, he's going to sit there in the bay, wait for a ship to come from New York for the British to give them more troops and more supplies. But the problem is, before that ship can get into the Chesapeake Bay, a French fleet that was coming from the Caribbean cut them off, and there was a blockade. Basically, Cornwallis was trapped. The war was over, right? That's going to be the victory. At Yorktown, the war is over. And what's an interesting story is after the war, it's customonial for the loser to put down their swords and their rifles and admit defeat. And the British soldiers, they were angry. They just, how did these British Americans, these backwater people, defeat the greatest empire in the world at the time? They just threw like little kids, just threw their guns and threw their knives on the ground. They were angry. Cornwallis wouldn't even meet for the official surrender. But the war is over. All right? The war is over. The United States had already been declared during the war, but they had to win the war. If they didn't win the war, that declaration might have meant nothing. But that was the fighting. It was amazing. This arrogant British strong army was defeated by what was considered the backwater colonists. But they got support from the French. So America owes lots of gratitude to the French. Now, during the war, as I mentioned, before the war started, the war was not about independence. The war was about getting their rights, leave them alone in Boston, right? And give them representation. Be treated like a British citizen, right? That was what the war was about. And the more radical elements certainly talked about independence or starting a new country. But it wasn't until Thomas Paine's Common Sense that it became the meaning of the war. Because this guy, Thomas Paine, who could influence people through his writing, he had only been in the United States. Well, it's not even the United States, it's British America at that time. He only been there for a short period of time. And he came and he wrote this pamphlet. And it was very critical of the British. He said things like, there is something absurd in supposing a continent can be perpetually governed by an island. These lines and this rhetoric was able to influence a lot of people, and it was a call for independence. And this pamphlet spread throughout the colonies, and it influenced people, and it became a war for independence. It was only 6 months later that we have the Declaration of Independence. So Thomas Jefferson, he wrote the Declaration of Independence. It was finished on July 2nd. July 4th, it was signed by everybody, and that's when the United States began, right? The war would still continue for 5 years until Yorktown, but officially, this is the beginning of the United States of America while they were fighting. And Thomas Paine's Common Sense had a lot to do with changing the mode of the war, right? And in this, we talked about the Enlightenment earlier, and the Enlightenment, the influence of John Locke and different Enlightenment thinkers. But John Locke wrote Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. Well, Thomas Jefferson wrote Life, Liberty, let me say it again. John Locke wrote Life, Liberty, and Property. Thomas Jefferson wrote Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. So he's clearly getting this language from John Locke. And some of the ideas that you'll find in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights come from protecting natural rights, which is very much influenced by John Locke. But an interesting thing about the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson owned many slaves, more than 100 slaves. He profited from slave labor on his property. His wife also died early, and he had numerous babies with one of his slaves. And maybe he was in love with her, or I'm not sure what. I don't know if it's very clear what the relationship they had, but he wanted to write. He was blaming in this document. He's blaming the tyrannical British for what they have done to the colonies. He also wanted to write in there. He blames them for starting the slave trade, and wanted to give them responsibility. And he wanted to say, let's abolish slavery. And this is a slave owner, and he often spoke negatively about slavery and talked about freeing his slaves. But he talked about during the Declaration of Independence, and if he did, it would have changed the course of history, obviously. And we see influences in 2020 from everything that's happened, right? But there were some people in the delegation, the Continental Congress, that told him not to. It's not clear who exactly they were, but they were worried of making some of the hardcore Southerners who depended on slavery angry. And they're in the middle of fighting a war, and they wanted to stay united. So he didn't write it. And there was this kind of idea that slavery would slowly fade away. People knew it was bad. There was an anti-slavery movement that would only grow and grow until the 1860s, obviously. You can't judge history by today's standards, but obviously this institution was awful, and people at that time did know that. And if it was put in here, I mean, it could have really changed. There maybe have never been a civil war, very likely, right? But the thing is even though they thought it would fade away, when the country started on July 4th, 1776, all 13 states, it was legal to have slaves. Now, in the North, it was becoming less and less. Like in Massachusetts, like 2% of this were slaves. In South Carolina, it'd be more than 50. And a lot of it just become economic necessities, right? And the North and South would grow further and further apart. And the demand they thought the demand would decrease, but with cotton in the 1800s, it would increase, right? But the idea at that time was slavery would slowly fade away. Founding fathers had said that, but it didn't. We know that. It did not. But shortly after the founding of the United States, more and more states in the North would make slavery illegal. So what are the consequences of the American Revolution? Well, obviously we have a new country, the United States of America. We also have a new form of government, a new framework, constitution called the Articles of Confederation. This will only be in existence for 8 years. There won't be a president, right? So there's no president. Because they don't want a central government. They don't want like a British, a King George III. That's what they're trying to avoid. And they want a weak government, a weak central government, and have the states have their own power. This is going to cause problems. And that's why in 1789 it's going to change, right? But nonetheless, we have this new form of government that's trying some of these new Enlightenment ideas of smaller government, weaker centralization, and but that's the first one, right? There's a Republican form of government, and many people say the United States is a democracy, but it really is more of a republic where you choose representatives who make decisions for you. So this is more of a Republican form of government. More participation in politics, more than British people, because it is mostly dependent on how much land you had. So rich white people usually, and if they had a lot of land, they have more say or vote in the local politics. And there was a lot of land in the New World, or in British America, which is now the United States of America, more so than England or Britain. So there was more participation, and that would grow as well over time. Religious toleration. United States is a very religious country, always has been. The Great Awakening revived it, and there will be another Great Awakening soon. But there was not so much in the 1600s or the early 1700s. There wasn't too much toleration for example, Catholics or Jews. But there's going to be more toleration. And of course, when the Constitution is written in 1789, there'll be freedom of religion. Westward expansion, they're going to not stop until they hit the Pacific Ocean. So that proclamation of 1763 is gone. Now they are free to move west. There's still Native Americans there, and that will be a continuity of problems that happen until the United States conquers all of the land from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The mercantilist economy is done. So this idea where they have to support the motherland is gone. Now they can trade with anybody. So there's new opportunities. It's less aristocratic and more meritocratic. So less about heredity and where you are in society to give you the good job or the government job. There's still some of that, but more about merit, or how good are you? What are your abilities, right? Some African Americans were freed. In fact, this is almost like the first emancipation, right? The Emancipation Proclamation from the Civil War freed the African slaves. It was more of a war strategy by Lincoln. It was the 13th Amendment which would free the slaves. But the British did the same thing. They emancipated many slaves, so they would fight for them, and they would promise freedom. And since they didn't win the war, a lot of them still got their freedom. Some of them had to go back to slavery, but some of them went to Britain. Some of them went to Nova Scotia, a certain area in Canada. And some of them actually went back to Africa. But some were freed, and unfortunately in the South and part of the North, slavery would continue in the United States of America. But the real losers, I'll say that in an insulting way, are the Native Americans, because this is the beginning of the end. Because certainly they weren't happy with the British, what they did, and the French and the Dutch taking their land in the East, and certainly these are all different tribes throughout the Americas, but the encroachment of the Europeans was very destructive to the Native Americans, and it was a disease that was the most destructive. But the British, at least King George III, told the colonists they couldn't go past the Appalachians, right? But now that the Americans have won, there's no line. They're going to go, and they're going to sign treaties or fight them in wars. And this is the beginning of the end for the Native Americans. But that's it. There is a new country. It's the United States of America. The Americans should have never won this war, but they did with the help of the French. And a new country was born. New ideals that were learned from the Enlightenment and even the Roman Republic. I mean, that'll be talked about next class with the Constitution. But it's a new country, an imperfect country with good ideas that weren't always practiced for many years and still need to be reminded of in 2020, as life is never perfect. But this is the beginning of the United States. All right. So thank you. If you got this far, that's amazing. If you got this far, you have to give me a thumbs up, or you have to subscribe and write some comments below, and also check out my store. The link is below, and share this with anybody. So I hope this was valuable. If there's anything else you would like to learn or like me to video, please just let me know. Thank you.